Good morning. Okay, so what is the topic today? Hemodynamic disorders. It's a revision class, right? So I hope that you guys already have some or a lot of ideas about the hemodynamic disorders. So it's a vast topic. Okay, so I won't be able to cover all the subheadings in a 1 hour class. So I will cover certain parts which are more important for your exam. So these are the points that I am going to cover: edema, effusion, hyperemia, congestion, hemostasis and thrombosis, embolism and infarction. Okay. Okay. So first, coming to edema. So edema is the result of movement of fluid from the vasculature into the interstitial spaces. The fluid may be protein poor, that is transudative, or protein conditions which can cause. So it can be caused by increased hydrostatic pressure or decreased colloid oncotic pressure. So these are two oppositely acting forces which counteract each other and balance each other inside the human body or inside any body for that matter. So increased hydrostatic pressure will be seen in case of heart failure, and decreased colloid or oncotic pressure will be caused by reduced plasma albumin. That can be either due to synthesis, which is hypoalbuminemia due to malnutrition, any kind of protein calorie malnutrition. It can also be due to some liver disease, and then it can be due to increased loss of protein, which we see in case of nephrotic syndrome. Okay, so the other causes of edema will be increased exudation of fluid despite of normal hydrostatic pressure or normal colloid oncotic pressure. So that decreased exudation of fluid into the interstitial spaces will occur due to increased vascular permeability, and that happens in any kind of inflammation. So what happens is, in inflammation there is vasodilation, and that will lead to increased vascular permeability, leading to increased oozing out of fluid. Okay, I will not go into much detail because I am assuming that you guys already know these things because this is a revision class. Okay, so another cause will be lymphatic obstruction, because normally this interstitial fluid gets drained by the lymphatics. So this lymphatic obstruction will happen in case of any kind of infection, like any infection. Can you name any infection that will cause lymphatic obstruction and will lead to edema, and which is very common in India, common in certain parts of India? Can you name an infection like that? No, it's not leishmaniasis. It is a parasite. Sorry? Elephantiasis, yes. What is the name of the worm that causes that? Wuchereria bancrofti, right? Yes. So that is an infective cause of inflammation, infective cause of edema. Okay. Another cause can be neoplasia. So any tumor that is near the lymphatics, that is compressing the lymphatics, or that is originating from the lymphatics, that will compress it, block it, so it will prevent lymphatic drainage from the interstitial tissue, and it will cause edema. Another cause will be sodium and water retention, which we see in renal failure. Okay, so normally there is some amount of movement of fluid across the cell barriers into the interstitium, but normally this fluid drains into the lymphatics, just as I discussed, and they return to the bloodstream via the thoracic duct. So it keeps the interstitium dry. But whenever there is free fluid in the body cavity, we call it effusion. So if that free fluid is accumulated into the peritoneal cavity, we will call it ascites. If it is accumulated into the pericardial cavity, we will call it pericardial effusion. And if it is accumulated in the pleural cavity, we will call it pleural effusion. Okay. So now coming to hyperemia and congestion. So basically hyperemia is increased blood supply to any organ or any tissue. So increased compared to the normal volume of blood supply. Okay, and in case of congestion, again there is increased blood volume in the tissue, but the causes are different, and we will discuss that. So in case of hyperemia, it is an active process, and in this case there is arteriolar dilatation. Okay, so this arteriolar dilation will lead to increased blood flow, and the affected tissue will turn red, that is called erythema, and it will also become warm if it is, say for example, if that erythema is happening in superficially over the skin. So we can feel that the part will become red and it will also become warm. So if there is any injury, any physical injury, okay, so that part will be swollen and it will be warm and it will be red. So basically I am talking about inflammation. So in case of inflammation, we will see, in case of any acute inflammation, we will see this hyperemia. So acute inflammation is an example of that. Okay, now coming to congestion, it is a passive process where the blood that has been supplied to a particular tissue is not being drained out. So the blood is getting accumulated inside the tissue. So there is basically stasis of blood. So congestion can be due to several causes. It can be systemic. Say for example, if there is cardiac failure, if there is congestive cardiac failure, it will lead to systemic congestion. But it can also be localized due to some isolated venous obstruction. Now congested tissue have an abnormal blue-red color. We call it cyanosis as well, and this happens due to accumulation of what? It's written there. It happens due to accumulation of deoxygenated hemoglobin, or basically carbaminohemoglobin. Hemoglobin with carbon dioxide, it turns blackish, so the tissue will look blue, red or cyanosed. Okay, so in case of long-standing chronic passive congestion, the associated chronic hypoxia may result in ischemic tissue injury, and it can also lead to scarring if it is long-standing. Now this is a diagrammatic representation of the different types of congestion. So basically what happens whenever we are talking about heart failure, it can be two types. Heart failure can be right-sided heart failure or left-sided heart failure. So in the right-sided chamber of the heart, that is the right atrium, what happens is the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava is opening, and they are draining all the blood from all the systems of the body. Okay, so the superior vena cava will drain the blood from the upper part of the body, from the head neck region and the arms, and the inferior vena cava will draw the blood from the abdominal region and the inferior extremities. So whenever there is failure of the right side of the heart, so this blood that is supposed to come back into the right atrium will not be able to come back. So there will be congestion in the organs that are being drained by both the superior and the inferior vena cava. So in case of right heart failure, we will see congestion in liver, spleen, kidney and also leg veins. Leg veins will also be congested. What happens in left heart failure? Left heart failure, the left side of the heart is the pumping chamber, the main major pumping chamber of the heart, that is the left ventricle. And whenever there is left ventricular failure, and there is left atrial failure as well, so what happens is, there are the veins that are draining in the left atrium are the pulmonary veins. Those are the only veins that are draining in the left atrium. So these pulmonary veins will not be able to drain the blood. There will be stasis in the pulmonary vasculature, which will lead to pulmonary congestion. So in right heart failure, we see congestion in liver, kidney, spleen and leg veins, and in left-sided failure, we see congestion in lungs. This is a very basic difference and you have to keep this in mind. Okay. Now first coming to pulmonary congestion. So here this congested lung tissue will turn dusky reddish blue color due to the red cell stasis and presence of deoxygenated hemoglobin. Microscopically, we will see markedly enlarged alveolar capillaries, alveolo-septal edema and also focal intra-alveolar hemorrhage. In case of chronic pulmonary congestion, which is often caused by congestive cardiac failure as well, the septa will be thickened and fibrotic, and the alveoli often will contain numerous macrophages within which we will see hemosiderin. So these are hemosiderin laden macrophages. In other words, we call them heart failure cells. Okay, so they are basically phagocytes which have phagocytosed some RBCs. So this is the picture. Here we can see this is the diagram, and this is the actual microscopic picture. This is the diagrammatic representation. So here these are the alveolar septa. Here you can see these are the alveolar septa. Inside the alveolar septa, if you are looking closely, you will be able to see these red dots. All of these are blood vessels and also dilated alveolar capillaries. Okay, so these are dilated alveolar capillaries. Now these are the intra-alveolar area. Now inside this alveoli we can see RBCs are there, and along with them these are cells. These are some macrophages. Okay, and inside these macrophages they have hemosiderin. So they are hemosiderin related macrophages, and in case of chronic venous congestion of lung, we call these cells the heart failure cells. Here you can also see these heart failure cells. Now coming to hepatic congestion. Now we will discuss about hepatic congestion and splenic congestion, and these will be caused by right-sided heart failure. So in acute hepatic congestion, the central vein and the sinusoids are distended, and chronic passive hepatic congestion, there will be centrilobular reddish brown and slightly depressed areas, and these happen due to the cell death in these particular areas, and these are accentuated against the surrounding zone of depressed uncongested tan area. So this will give the picture or the appearance of a nutmeg. Okay, and that's why we call this nutmeg liver. So if you look at this picture, the liver has this irregular surface. Okay, so certain parts are depressed and around them the parts are elevated, and diagrammatically we can see that is this modeling appearance. Okay, so there is this alternate pattern of dark congestion and pale areas of fatty change. Coming to CVC spleen, so here it is again caused by right heart failure, and it can also be caused by portal hypertension and liver cirrhosis. Grossly, the spleen in early stage, it is slightly or moderately enlarged in the early stage of congestion. Okay, so that can be up to 250 gram, where the normal weight of spleen is 150 gram. But if there is long standing splenic congestion, if there is massive splenomegaly, it can also weigh up to 1000 gram, 500 to 1000 gram. So basically it can weigh up to 1 kg. The organ is deeply congested, tense and cyanotic. Okay, so this is the gross picture of a congestive spleen, chronic venous congestion spleen, and we can see that the spleen is enlarged, and this is the cut section where we can see that there is a gray tan color. So in microscopy we can see two areas, the red pulp and the white pulp. So in the red pulp, this red pulp will be enlarged due to venous congestions, because they are mainly formed by the veins and the sinusoids. Okay, so in case of CVC spleen, there will be sinusoidal dilatation leading to red pulp enlargement, and there will also be areas of recent and old hemorrhages. And then there is hyperplasia of reticuloendothelial cells in this red pulp. These cells are basically the splenic macrophages. Can anyone name the name of the splenic macrophages? Because in our body there are different types of macrophages in different parts of different organs of our body, and we have particular names for them. For example, we have Langerhans cell in skin. Okay, we have Kapha cells in liver. So what are the name of these cells in spleen? Can anyone name them? This is a very important MCQ as well. Okay, so the splenic macrophages are called the littoral cells. Okay, you can write it down. So another finding is there will be fibrous thickening of capsule and of the trabecula. So some hemorrhage of this tissue overlying the fibrosis, they get deposits of hemosiderin pigments and calcium. So together they will get organized and form the gamma antibodies. Okay. So this is a thickened capsule. These are the congested sinusoids. These are the gamma antibodies. In actual microscopy, we see them as these blackish brown deposits inside the congested spleen. And these are very characteristic of chronic venous congestion of spleen. Now coming to hemostasis. So hemostasis can be defined as a simple process by which blood clots at the site of vascular injury. In hemorrhagic disorders, which are characterized by excessive bleeding, hemostatic mechanisms are either blunted or insufficient to prevent the blood loss. By contrast, in the thrombotic disorders, which are often referred to thrombi, from within the blood vessels or within the chambers of the heart, we can see blood clots. And these blood clots are formed because increased amount of hemostasis is happening inside the body. So normally it's an orchestrated process. You all know it is attributed by the platelets, clotting factors and the endothelium, and it occurs at the site of vascular injury and culminates in formation of blood clot. So this will basically limit or prevent the extent of bleeding. This is the normal scenario. But what happens in abnormal condition, that we will discuss. But before that, we will discuss the normal steps of hemostasis. You all know there are certain steps of normal hemostasis. The first step will be arteriolar vasoconstriction, which will be followed by primary hemostasis, which will be again followed by secondary hemostasis, and then there will be thrombin generation, then there will be clot formation, there will be stabilization and resorption of clot. So coming to the first steps, so first there is vasoconstriction. So what happens is, whenever there is any vascular injury, first the lining epithelium of the blood vessel, the endothelium, there will be a breach. So whenever there is breach of endothelium, the underlying collagen gets exposed. Okay. So whenever this collagen is exposed, there is a reflex vasoconstriction. Next, there are certain factors which will be secreted by the endothelium. Okay, so the endothelium will cause platelet adhesion, and once the platelet adhere to the basement membrane, so this is the exposed basement membrane. Here these are the endothelial cells. Okay, here the endothelial cells are lost because of injury. So the basement membrane and the collagen is exposed. So the platelet is adhering to the collagen. Now, what is the factor that helps this platelet adhesion? This is a revision class, and this is a very important question. Which factor is responsible for platelet adhesion to the towards the basement membrane, and also the von Willebrand factor that is there in the basement membrane? What is the name of that factor? Okay, we will see that in next slide. Also, along with adhesion with the basement membrane, the platelets will adhere to each other as well. Okay, so another factor will work there for the mutual adhesion of the platelets. So this is another diagram showing the factors I was talking about. So GP1B is the factor that helps in platelet adhesion with the basement membrane. Okay, so basically that adhesion appears through an interaction between the platelet receptor GP1B and the von Willebrand factor that is present in the vessel wall. And so this is an interaction, this is a very important interaction. So whenever there will be mutation or any defect in this GP1B factor, this interaction will be lost, leading to von Willebrand disease. Okay, so this will be due to the von Willebrand factor deficiency. Another factor that plays an important role here is the GP2B3A complex. So this is the GP2B3A complex. Here we can see that two platelets are interacting with each other. So this particular complex helps a platelet to bind with another platelet with the help of this fibrinogen, and in If there is any defect in this GP2B3A complex, it will lead to bleeding disorder called Glanzmann thrombasthenia, that's a platelet disorder. Okay. Another factor, that is the GP1B, whenever it is defective, it will lead to Barnard-Solier syndrome. So, after primary hemostasis, there will be secondary hemostasis. And in secondary hemostasis, there will be the ultimate goal of the secondary hemostasis is deposition of fibrin. So, vascular injury exposes the tissue factor, and this tissue factor in turn will activate the factor 7, which will culminate in thrombin generation. Now, this thrombin will cleave the circulating fibrinogen into insoluble fibrin, creating a fibrin meshwork, and is also a potent activator of the platelets, which will again lead to platelet aggregation, and this platelet aggregation along with the fibrin meshwork will form the hemostatic plug. Now, this hemostatic plug, that is the clot, it will be stabilized by polymerization of fibrin and platelet aggregates, and they will undergo contraction and prevent this solid permanent plug to prevent the further hemorrhage. At this stage, counter-regulatory mechanisms such as tissue plasminogen activator, that is TPA, made by the endothelial cells, are set into motion that limit the clotting, and they will eventually lead to clot resorption and tissue repair. Okay, so these are the steps of secondary hemostasis. First, there will be tissue factor secretion. Now, that tissue factor in turn will activate factor 7, which will lead to thrombin generation, and which again will lead to fibrin polymerization, and this is the fibrin meshwork, and after that TPA and thrombomodulin together, they will help in clot maturation and clot resorption. Okay, now just to brush up your knowledge a bit, so there are two pathways of hemostasis. One is intrinsic pathway and one is extrinsic pathway. So basically, this is the setting in laboratory, and this is the setting in our body, that is in vivo. So basically, in laboratory, whenever we are performing the coagulation tests, we are seeing these two pathways, whether there is any defect in the extrinsic or the intrinsic pathway. So the intrinsic pathway will start with factor 12 and will end in the factor 9 and factor 8 complex, whereas the extrinsic pathway will start with the tissue factor and will end in the tissue factor 7 complex. Both of them will activate the factor 10, will create the activated factor 10A, which will again convert prothrombin into thrombin, and thrombin will convert the fibrinogen into insoluble fibrin. Okay, so a very easy question for all of you. Which test are we performing to test this intrinsic pathway? And which test are we performing to test the extrinsic pathway in laboratory? What are the most commonly done coagulation tests in our laboratory? Yes, a little bit louder, please. You are right. Just say it loud. APTT, that is full form activated partial prothrombin time. Okay, and the other test is prothrombin time, that is PT. So in APTT, which pathway are we testing in APTT? Intrinsic pathway, exactly right, very good. And in PT, that is the prothrombin time test, we are testing the extrinsic pathway. So whenever there is any hemophilia, that is hemophilia A or B, there will be deficiency of either factor 8 or factor 9, APTT will be prolonged. And whenever there will be any liver disease, in liver disease both can be prolonged, but particularly PT will be prolonged. Okay, so this is just a schematic diagram which shows the role of thrombin. Now, in the last slide, we saw that how thrombin gets generated. Now, this thrombin plays a very important role in our body because it activates simultaneously activates a lot of cells and factors inside our body. First, it activates the platelet and helps in secretion of thromboxane A2. That again will lead to vasoconstriction. Okay. Again, it will play an important role in converting producing fibrin from the fibrinogen. Again, thrombin will activate endothelium. It will also do lymphocyte activation, and it will also cause neutrophil adhesion. And by activating the endothelial cells and the monocytes, it helps to secrete platelet-derived growth factor, which will increase the proliferation of smooth muscle cells. Okay, so thus thrombin play a very important role. Now coming to thrombosis, that is increased hemostasis, abnormally increased hemostasis. So in case of thrombosis, we can see this triad named Virchow triad. So here three things are playing a role. One is endothelial injury, second is stasis or turbulent blood flow, and the third is hypercoagulable state. So whenever there is hypercholesterolemia or any kind of inflammation, there will be endothelial injury. And whenever there is abnormal blood flow which is caused by heart diseases like atrial fibrillation, in case of a patient who is in a long prolonged bed rest, also if there is atherosclerosis and narrowing of vessels, there will be turbulence. And then the final part of the triad is hypercoagulability, which can be inherited, which can be acquired. We will discuss them. The first coming to the endothelial activation, and it can be produced by many causes. So some of which are physical injury, any physical injury to the endothelial cell, any infectious agent, any kind of infection of the blood, any kind of blood-borne infection will cause this. Abnormal blood flow, inflammatory mediators, metabolic abnormalities such as hypercholesterolemia and homocystinemia, and also the toxins from cigarette smoke is very notorious for injuring the endothelial cells. So what happens once the endothelial cell is activated? So these endothelial cells have two types of activity: procoagulant activity and anticoagulant activity. So the procoagulant changes will be these, that the endothelial cells once activated will secrete some inflammatory cytokines, and they will downregulate the expression of thrombomodulin, the key modulator of thrombin activity, thus enhancing the procoagulant and the pro-inflammatory actions of thrombin. Now this inflamed endothelial is also downregulating the expression of other anticoagulants such as protein C and tissue factor protein inhibitor, and thus they further promote the procoagulant state. Now the antifibrinolytic effects are that they secrete the plasminogen activator inhibitor, that is the PAI, which will limit the fibrinolysis. So once fibrinolysis is limited, what will happen is fibrinolysis is not occurring. So the fibrin clot that was supposed to be resolved is not being resolved. So thus it will again be a factor which will lead to development of thrombi. This is just the thing I discussed in the previous slide, a diagrammatic representation of that same thing. So coming to the alterations in the normal blood flow. So what happens is the normally blood flow is laminar. That is the normal pattern of blood flow inside our body. So whenever that laminar blood flow is lost, there will be turbulence and stasis, and they will lead to endothelial activation. As we saw before, that turbulence is important cause of endothelial activation, and once this endothelial activation is there, it will enhance the procoagulant activity and leukocyte adhesion. And again, when the laminar flow is disrupted, they will bring the platelets in contact with the endothelium, and this turbulence also contributes to arterial and cardiac thrombosis by causing endothelial injury and dysfunction, and as well as by forming counter current that contribute to local pockets of stasis. Okay. So another major contributor of these stasis is venous thrombi. Now coming to our third component of the triad, that is hypercoagulable state. So there can be various reasons of that state. The primary or the genetic reasons can be, commonly we can see factor 5 mutation, prothrombin mutation, and increased levels of factor 8, 9, 11 or fibrinogen. The relatively rare causes are antithrombin 3 deficiency, protein C deficiency, and proteinase deficiency. And the very rare causes are fibrinolysis defect and homozygous homocystinuria. Okay, now third causes of hypercoagulable states are prolonged bed rest or immobilization, myocardial infarction, atrial fibrillation, tissue injury, cancer, prosthetic cardiac valves, DIC, heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome. And the other risk factors other than this for thrombosis are any kind of cardiomyopathy, nephrotic syndrome, hyperestrogenic states, OCP use, sickle cell anemia, and smoking. This is the fibrinolytic system, and what happens here, these are the platelets, and that is the plasmins, and this is the plasminogen that is getting converted into plasmin. So the plasminogen activated inhibitor PAI, which is secreted by the endothelial cells, will basically inhibit the action of TPA, and it will also inhibit the process of clot resorption. Thus it will result in formation of thrombus and create a procoagulant state. Okay, so the clinical features of different thrombi can be, we can see these clinical features whenever these thrombi are obstructing any vessel. So they can obstruct artery or vein, or they can also give rise to emboli. So venous thrombi can cause painful congestion and edema distal to an obstruction, but mainly the concern in these cases will be formation of embolization. So first we come to venous thrombosis. So most commonly they occur in the superficial and the deep veins of the leg and can cause local congestion, swelling, pain, tenderness, but they rarely embolize. The associated edema and impaired venous drainage predispose the overlying skin into developing certain ulcers which are called the varicose ulcers. So these are the varicose veins, and these are the varicose ulcers which are caused in the skin because of this superficial venous congestion. So whenever there is a deep vein thrombosis which involves the large vein of the leg at or above the knee joint, it is considered serious because such thrombi is very prone to formation of embolus, and they will clots will dislodge from the embolus, and this embolus can go and block the pulmonary artery, giving rise to pulmonary infarction. Okay, now the arterial and cardiac thrombosis. Atherosclerosis is a major cause of arterial thrombosis because it is associated with loss of endothelial integrity and with abnormal blood flow. Both cardiac and aortic mural thrombi are prone to embolus. Although any tissue can be affected, the brain, kidney, spleen are particularly likely because they are very rich in blood supply. So they are very prone to embolization. So thrombi often have the gross and microscopic appearance of lamination, and these laminations are called lines of Zahn. So these are pale platelet and fibrin deposits alternating with dark red cell rich layers. Such lamination that we can see here. So these are the lines. Okay. This is the diagrammatic picture and this is the real microscopic picture. So this line of Zahn is very characteristic of clot, and they help to distinguish antemortem clots from post-mortem clots, because an antemortem clots will have these lines of Zahn, but the post-mortem clots, they will not have this. Okay. So the thrombi that occur in heart chamber or in the aortic lumen are designated as the mural thrombi and are caused by abnormal myocardial contraction, that is arrhythmia, dilated cardiomyopathy, myocardial infarction, and endomyocardial injury. So this is the mural thrombi. You can see the thrombus and in the left and also the right ventricular apex, near the apex, and in the second picture we can see numerous friable mural thrombi superimposed on the advanced atherosclerotic lesion of the proximal aorta. This one is more obvious. So for your understanding, this one is a better picture. Okay, so what are the fates of thrombus? I will not go into detail. So the thrombus can go through certain fates. Four are the main fates, that is resolution, organization, propagation, and thromboembolism. These four are the main fate of thrombus. Now coming to embolism. An embolus is a detached intravascular solid liquid or gaseous mass that is carried by the blood from its point of origin to a distant site, but it often causes tissue dysfunction or infarction. The vast majority of emboli are dislodged thrombi, hence the term thromboembolism. Other rare emboli are composed of fat droplet, nitrogen bubble, atherosclerotic debris, bone marrow, foreign body. So we will describe each of these. So this is pulmonary embolism. First, we will discuss that because that is a very severe cause of mortality and morbidity. So these are more common in hospitalized bedridden patients and can occur in ambulatory patients as well, and they are normally originated from the large veins of the lower leg, that is the popliteal, femoral and iliac vein. They are the 95% source of pulmonary emboli. The less common sources include thrombi in the varicosities of superficial veins, that is the great saphenous vein, and the pelvic vein. Now, they can be clinically silent in 80 to 90%, 60 to 80% of cases if they are small. But when they become organized, they get incorporated into the vascular wall. So these organized emboli can lead to sudden death, acute cardiac failure, which is also called cor pulmonale, or cardiovascular collapse when they obstruct 60% or more of the circulation. So this is a thrombus. So basically, it came from the lower extremity deep vein, and this is the pulmonary artery. This is the branching point of the pulmonary artery, and here we can see a thrombus is blocking this junction. So the consequences of pulmonary embolism will be sudden death, acute cor pulmonale. So what is cor pulmonale? Cor pulmonale is heart failure that is caused by some lung cause, that is cor pulmonale, and then there will be pulmonary infarction. It can also give rise to pulmonary hemorrhage. There will be pulmonary hypertension, chronic cor pulmonale, and pulmonary arteriosclerosis. It can also get resolved in few cases. Now coming to systemic thromboembolism. So it is normally arterial, and they can be derived from the following sources, like within the heart. So the 80 to 85% of arterial emboli are mural thrombi in the left atrium or the left ventricle. The vegetations on the mitral valve or the aortic valve can also generate arterial thrombi, arterial emboli. Causes within the arteries, so they include atherosclerotic plaque, aortic aneurysm, and also pulmonary veins. They develop in relationship with these things. Now fat embolism. This is presence of microscopic flat globule inside the circulation. So what happens is, whenever there is fracture of long bone, the hematopoietic bone marrow can cause fat embolism. As we know that much of the bone marrow is formed by fat cells, and as the age increases in a person, more and more fat is replacing the marrow spaces. So whenever fracture of long bone is there, it will lead to hematopoietic bone marrow embolization in the vessels. Rarely, it is also seen in the setting of soft tissue trauma and burns, and 90% individuals with severe skeletal injury can also present with this. So this is bone marrow embolus within the pulmonary circulation. So this particle is bone marrow particle. As we can see, these are the white spaces. This is basically the fat droplets. As fat does not take the stain in hematoxylin and eosin stain, in H&E stain we see fat as empty white spaces, and these are the marrow cells. These are the hematopoietic stem cells. Okay. Now there is an entity called fat embolism syndrome. it will, in this particular case, the patient will present with pulmonary insufficiency, neurologic symptoms, anemia, and thrombocytopenia. Typically, 1 to 3 days after the injury, there will be sudden onset of tachypnea, dyspnea, tachycardia, irritability. Sometimes the patient can progress to coma and delirium. And in 5 to 15% cases, this will be fatal. Now coming to gas embolism, air, nitrogen and other gases can produce bubbles within the circulation and obstruct the blood vessel, causing damage to the tissue. Two main forms are there. One is air embolism and one is decompression sickness. So whenever air embolism occurs, it is introduced in the venous and the arterial circulation. Venous air embolism, so in this case, air may be sucked into systemic veins under the following circumstances, like operation of the head and neck, trauma, obstetrical operations and trauma, during childbirth by normal vaginal delivery, C-section and abortions, intravenous fluid of blood, infusion of blood and fluid. This is very common, and many of us have experienced this. Experience this threat that whenever a patient is on IV saline treatment, whenever we are changing the bottle from one bottle is empty and we have to give a new bottle. So if the procedure is not done properly, it may lead to air embolism. Angiography. During venous angiographic procedures, air may be entrapped into a large vein, causing air embolism. Arterial air embolism, in this case, entry of air is seen in pulmonary vein or its tributary and may occur in conditions like cardiothoracic surgery and paradoxical air embolism, which occurs due to passage of venous air emboli to the arterial side of circulation through a patent foramen oval. So the effects of arterial air embolism will be, there will be marbling of skin due to blockade of cutaneous vessels. There will be air bubbles in the retinal vessels and pallor of tongue due to occlusion of branch of lingual artery. Coronary or cerebral arterial air embolism may cause sudden death. Okay, so coming to decompression sickness, it is also known as Kaizen's disease. It is produced when individual decompresses suddenly. So what is decompression? Basically, whenever a person goes from a particular situation to another situation where there is a steep difference of barometric or the atmospheric pressure. So whenever the person is going from a high atmospheric pressure to a low atmospheric pressure, this kind of decompression sickness will occur. So it can be from high atmospheric pressure to normal level or from normal atmospheric pressure to low level. So it is very common in divers, in scuba divers, and also workers in caissons or diving bells, tunnels, who descend to high atmospheric pressure. So what happens is, for scuba divers, as we go deeper in under the sea, under the ocean, the water pressure gets very, very high. So as one goes like 10 meter under the water pressure, there will be very high. So if from that particular point one comes rapidly, one ascends to the surface of the sea or the sea surface, there will be rapid decompression, because the person is coming from a point of high atmospheric pressure to a normal atmospheric pressure, and this kind of decompression will lead to increased amount of atmospheric gases, mainly nitrogen and other gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, that are dissolved in the blood and tissue. So due to change of atmospheric pressure, these gases will form bubbles, okay, and these bubbles will come out of the fatty tissue. These gases will come out as bubbles, and these fatty tissue have have an affinity for nitrogen, so this fatty tissue will get more affected. So it can have two types of effect, the acute and the chronic. In acute form, there will be acute obstruction of small blood vessels in the vicinity of joint and skeletal muscle, which will cause bends as the patient doubles up in bed due to acute pain in joint and ligament and tendons. And there will be chokes that will occur due to accumulation of bubbles in the lungs, resulting in respiratory distress. And the cerebral effects may manifest in the form of vertigo, coma, and sometimes death. The chronic effect of decompression sickness can be foci of ischemic necrosis throughout the body, especially the skeletal system, which will lead to avascular necrosis of bone, neurological symptoms, lung involvement in form of pulmonary hemorrhage, edema, emphysema, and they will result in dyspnea, tachypnea, non-productive cough and chest pain. The skin manifestations include itching, patchy erythema, cyanosis, and edema. Now coming to amniotic fluid embolism, this is a very serious, unpredictable and unpreventable cause of maternal mortality. So during labor, the immediate postpartum period, the contents of the amniotic fluid may enter the uterine veins and reach the site of the heart, causing fatal complication. Clinically, it will present as sudden respiratory distress, dyspnea, deep cyanosis, cardiovascular shock, convulsion, coma, and it can also cause unexpected death of the mother. So the notable changes we can see here in the lungs are pulmonary hemorrhage, congestion, edema. We can also see dilatation of right side of heart. These changes are associated with identifiable amount of amniotic fluid contents within the pulmonary microcirculation. Next, coming to tumor embolism. Malignant tumor cells invade the local blood vessel and may form tumor emboli, which are to be lodged elsewhere, producing metastatic tumor deposit. Notable examples are clear cell carcinoma of kidney, carcinoma of lung, malignant melanoma. So basically this is a form of metastasis of tumor, particularly tumor which are prone to metastasize to the vasculature, to the blood vessels. They will form tumor embolus in the vessels. So coming to infarct, which is our last topic of the day. An infarct is an area of ischemic necrosis caused by occlusion of either arterial supply or venous drainage. Arterial thrombosis or arterial embolism underlies the vast majority of infarctions. Less common causes of arterial obstruction leading to infarction include local vasospasm, hemorrhage into an atheromatous plaque, or extrinsic vessel compression. Other uncommon causes can be torsion of a vessel, which is seen in testicular torsion or intestinal volvulus, and it can also be seen in traumatic vascular rupture or vascular compromise by edema or by entrapment in a hernia sac. Okay, so there are two types of infarcts, red infarct and white infarct. So in red infarct, it is occurring due to venous congestion or venous occlusion, which will lead to venous congestion. So in certain tissues which are loose and spongy, so by saying loose and spongy, the first tissue that comes to mind is the lungs. Okay, so here the blood can collect in an infarcted zone, and in a tissue with dual circulation, lung and small intestine, this will allow the blood to flow from an unobstructed parallel supply into the necrotic zone. This can also be seen in a tissue which was previously congested by sluggish venous outflow, and when the flow is re-established in a site of previous arterial occlusion or necrosis. White infarct occur with arterial occlusions in solid organs with end arterial circulations. So the basic difference between white infarct and red infarct is the organs that are affected by red infarcts are typically organs that are having dual vascular supply. Chief example of that is lung. It is having a systemic supply, it is also having a pulmonary supply. There is pulmonary circulation, there is systemic circulation. It is supplied by both pulmonary artery, and it is also having the supply from the hepatic arteries and the pulmonary veins. Okay, so there is this dual supply. In case of white infarct, it will occur in organs that is having a single supply, or that is being supplied by end arteries. So here what happens, the tissue density limits the seepage of blood from adjoining capillary beds into the necrotic area. So this is seen in tissue that has higher density like liver or spleen. So here the infarct will tend to be wedge shaped with the occluded vessel at the apex and the periphery of the organ forming the base. Fresh infarcts are poorly defined and slightly hemorrhagic, but over a few days, the margins will tend to be more prominent, more defined, and giving the typical wedge shape. So, with further passage of time, infarcts resulting from arterial occlusions in organs without a dual blood supply typically become progressively paler and more sharply defined. In comparison, in the lung hemorrhagic infarcts are the rule. Okay, so extravasacular red cells in the hemorrhagic infarcts are phagocytosed by macrophages which convert heme iron into hemosiderin. So the dominant histologic characteristic of infarction is ischemic coagulative necrosis, which takes 4 to 12 hours for the dead tissue to show the microscopic evidence. Acute inflammation is present along the margin of the infarcts within few hours and is usually well defined within 1 to 2 days. And after that, a reparative response will begin. If the tissue harbors tissue stem cell, parenchymal regeneration can occur at the periphery where the underlying stromal architecture is preserved. However, most infarcts are ultimately replaced by scar. Though in the central nervous system, infarction results in liquefactive necrosis. So this is an exception. Brain is an exception. Septic infarctions occur when infected cardiac valve vegetations embolize or when microbes seed necrotic tissue. In these cases, the infarct is converted to an abscess with a correspondingly greater inflammatory response. Eventual sequence of organization, however, follows the pattern that we have already described here. So this is picture of red infarct. So this is the hemorrhagic, roughly wedge-shaped pulmonary red infarct, and this is an infarct in spleen. This is a white infarct in spleen, as we can see this area of demarcation, and it has lost its blood supply. Okay, so that concludes today's class. If anyone has any question, you can ask me. Thank you.